Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Science versus Bullshit. I'm gonna do my usual just live check and see if we're live. Or maybe it's gonna make me wait. No, it's not. Okay, right, we're good. Oh, that might have been the smoothest yet, not to jinx it. Also, the audio went funny last time. So if anyone is watching and the audio goes funny, please do tell me ASAP. And I'm not sure what I'll do about that, but I'll try and do something. In fact, maybe in the background I could be well clever. What's the best thing to record it on? Voice memo. Then I have a little backup. Could have thought about this before, but hey, it's gonna work. iCloud syncing? No. Okay. Right, here we go. Double backup. Okay, great. Right, we do have some excellent questions today. One that actually really made me think quite a lot as well, which I love. So, okay, oh, that was horrible, wasn't it? Right, okay, good. Right. So, first thing I wanted to discuss was something I had a discussion with a coach about today, and that was kind of around like falling for this narrative. And I certainly used to fall for it myself, of seeing most of the fitness industry tell people that, like, you know, it's okay to just let yourself go over Christmas and it's not a big deal and people need to chill out. And I get that for some people that probably is the right message. Like if you're someone who's maybe borderline like disordered eating type tendencies, feels like they need to track every single calorie that they consume and is stressing out about tracking their Christmas dinner or something. I'm like, yeah, that's probably quite a good message. But for a lot of people, it's not a useful message and it's not really supported by the data. And the data shows that most people gain most of their weight between November and January. So actually, it's a time where you probably need to be a little bit more aware of the choices that you're making. And that's not to say like, don't have Christmas dinner or stress out about things or avoid having fun or try and be as on point as you can throughout the whole thing. It's more about actually choosing your indulgences. And I went into this in a little bit more depth in the last episode that I did. If you haven't listened to the last podcast, I'd highly recommend that you do, because I'm hoping it will kind of shift the way that you're thinking coming into this time of year. And there's really interesting studies that show that if you're, what's the right way to frame this? Basically, if you have less of something, you enjoy it more, which may seem quite obvious to people, but then I think we don't really think about it with food. But anyway, like, you know, it's not a treat anymore if you're having it all the time. So maybe think about choosing your indulgences and actually really enjoying them. But anyway, that is episode 872 of the ESG Fitness podcast. So go and have a little listen to that. If you have any questions, fire away. And then a question I got this week was about GLP-1 drugs. And I was sent a reel with the message, I feel like this is bad, recommending GLP-1 if in perimenopause to help. But really, especially if someone's not overweight. Didn't know if this would be a good question for science versus bullshit. Well, I think it's a great question for science versus bullshit, which is why it's made the cut. So let's delve into the post and then like the evidence behind it. So the post says, yes, as a doctor, I recommend GLP-1 drugs, weight loss injections, for many of my perimenopause and menopause patients. But let me be clear, they're not a replacement for eating well, moving your body, or making lifestyle changes. They're in addition. They are a clinical tool that support your physiology during the time of huge hormonal changes. So this part I agree with, as in the part about weight loss drugs not being a replacement for diet and exercise. That part, pretty passionate about. And then she says, in midlife, many women experience weight gain around the middle, not because they're not trying, but because, and then there's a list of things. I'm going to go through these, right? So the first one is hormonal shifts that slow your metabolism. So this isn't true. And we have quite a lot of longitudinal studies that show this, that your metabolic rate stays relatively constant throughout menopause. There's not this massive drop at menopause, which if your metabolism was slowing because you were going through menopause, we would see in the data. This is data of huge number of people. So it's really quite like robust data. And it kind of explains, or what's the right, debunks, I guess, the myth that as you age, your metabolism slows down. Actually, it stays relatively constant until you're, I think it's about 70, and then you do see quite a big decline. And that's related to the decline that you see in muscle mass at that age. So that one I don't agree with. The second one is muscle mass naturally declines. Again, not true. Muscle mass doesn't naturally decline just because you're in midlife. It is directly related to the amount that you use muscle. And you can absolutely build muscle going through the menopausal years. You can absolutely build muscle in midlife. It's not just because you're of a certain age, you're going to lose muscle. So put it very simply, it's use it or lose it, right? So if you're still using it, then yes, you will maintain it. And then she says the final reason, like poor sleep, anxiety, stress, and the constant juggle of all of it add pressure to the body. So 100% yes, agree with this. It's a lot to deal with. That's why a lot of people struggle with their weight around midlife. Then she says, GLP-1s can help your body work more efficiently, reduce metabolic stress, and create breathing room so that you can focus on rebuilding healthy habits. So the increased efficiency and reduced metabolic stress would, if they were occurring, come from fat loss. So yes, if GLP-1 drugs help you lose fat, which is fat that you actually needed to lose, then correct, like this might be of benefit to you. But there is also a potential negative to this, because the last thing you do want to do in midlife is lose muscle mass. And given that many people are not exercising, and many, and again, not all, are actually less likely to exercise on GLP-1 drugs, because there's still the kind of narrative of like, the only reason I'd exercise is to lose weight. And if I can do it without exercise, then why would I bother exercising? Of course, everybody here knows that's not true. But if you're looking at general population, I think a lot of people are now taking these drugs and being like, great, I can lose weight without going to the gym. Why would I bother going to the gym? So that's quite a worrying thing if these are being given out to treat like symptoms of perimenopause, which I'm going to come on to and what the research behind that is at the moment. And some of the time, the reason that people aren't exercising is because they're not given the support, they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the confidence to do it. And then you can often end up in a worse position if you're someone who's come for, I mean, in this example, like I'm assuming like menopause treatment, and you're given a GLP-1 drug and you're not exercising, then actually you could be losing muscle mass and potentially also bone mineral density as well. So it's like side note for this, like I would really love to see, and this is like a call for all patients prescribed GLP-1 drugs, to also be told that they must resistance train. Like it is unbelievably important, in the same way that you might be told like you can't drink on a certain medication, or you have to finish your course of antibiotics. Like, yes, of course, there are still people that don't do that. But I fear that sometimes it's like, yeah, take this drug, and well, by the way, you should still focus on diet and exercise. Like, as like a like little add-on as they walk out the door. Like, it needs to be a fundamental thing. Like, these drugs will not work to make you healthier if you are not also exercising. In fact, you could end up in a worse position if you're not exercising. And the last thing we want is for someone to take these drugs, especially if they can't stay on them long term. So they're taking them for a short period of time. We know that if you don't focus on a long-term plan and you have been building like healthy habits, including exercise and nutrition and looking at what you're actually eating, not just taking the medication, if you come off it, you're much more likely to regain the weight. Now you're in a position where you're overweight again, but you have even less muscle mass. And actually metabolically, you'll be in a much worse position. So that part is a bit of a tangent here, but like so unbelievably important. So it shouldn't just be like, yeah, take this drug and still do some diet and exercise, see you later. It should be, you must strength train at least 3 times a week. Do you need some guidance on this? And then you would give guidance, right? And now if a doctor's prescribing this, like I don't expect a doctor to know this, right? You would never give, I guess my analogy here is like, you would never give a medicine and then be like, I'm not going to tell you how to take it. You know, you never be like, here's your HRT, but I'm not going to tell you when to take it, how much to take, at what time of day, you know, how any of that works. Like, much like this should be, you must do the strength training with it. And like I say, I don't expect doctors to know that. And this post is actually quite a good example of like doctors maybe not being up to date with the research on metabolism or muscle loss or how you could mitigate that or exercise prescription. But also that's okay. Like I don't expect it. Like you wouldn't expect medical advice from me, each to their own expertise, right? So you would be referring out if they would need that. But I mean, you should be getting, in my opinion, some kind of exercise prescription if you are going to take these medications. So I've gone on a little bit of tangent. Where was I with this? Okay, yeah, the original question was about drugs like Mounjaro and Ozempic for perimenopausal women or menopausal women. And I did go and look at some of the claims. So, first of all, there's no strong clinical evidence at the moment that would enforce or would kind of support the recommendation of using these drugs for women who are perimenopausal, menopausal, and not overweight, right? So at the moment, these drugs from a clinical perspective should be prescribed to people who are type 2 diabetic or obese or overweight with some kind of other comorbidity, not someone who is a normal weight and then going through perimenopause. There's actually much better things you could be giving them, primarily HRT. But there are some claims that people make, so I've gone through them. One of them is that the reduction in estrogen can impair appetite regulation. There is some research around this. So you might experience increased hunger, reduced satiety, more of a strong pull to overeat and feel like more reward from food. And then obviously we notice like the fat redistribution around the abdomen. Now, GLP-1 drugs would help for this if you need to lose weight, you know, so if that hunger dysregulation leads to weight gain, then yeah, the rationale, I guess, makes sense that you could mitigate some of that with GLP-1 drugs, which are very effective at increasing satiety and reducing hunger. The second reason that people suggest these is insulin resistance, which I don't think is a particularly good reason to be taking these medications. In the context of perimenopause, not in the context of like pre-diabetes or diabetes. For like a healthy weight woman who's already active, it's much better to focus on diet and exercise. And actually the impact of perimenopause on insulin resistance is relatively small. And unless it's showing up in a blood test and your doctor's like, you actually have quite high fasting glucose levels or higher than they used to be, maybe there's something we need to do about it, then there's not really anything proactive that you need to be doing about that, apart from your usual diet and exercise that you'd be doing at any age, regardless of menopause status. And then one that's quite interesting, and I'm not sure I'm convinced by the research, or I'm definitely not convinced by the research at the moment, is that GLP-1 medications can improve vascular symptoms. So things like hot flushes or night sweats, and because of that, like overall sleep quality. And that's because GLP-1 does have some kind of interaction with your temperature regulation. So there might be something in that, but so far HRT has a much stronger impact. Now, if you were someone who couldn't take HRT for some specific reason, maybe it might have a small impact. I'm willing to bet a lot of the benefits that we see are from fat loss, and it's quite hard in studies at the moment to distinguish, you know, unless they're only done in women that are of a healthy weight already, distinguish the benefits. So that's something to consider. And then you also have to be aware that as much as we like to think like it's all NHS and, you know, doctors always want the best for you, which for the vast, vast, vast majority of the time, I do think that that is true. So I don't want anyone to be like, oh, you're like, you know, telling everyone big pharma, blah, blah, blah. But there are so many financial incentives for doctors to do certain things, whether it's supplement companies, whether it's promoting GLP-1 drugs. And even if it doesn't look like they're getting a kickback, there's actually quite a few ways around this. It could be that they actually own shares in the company. It could be that they're getting some kind of financial reward in a slightly different way. A lot of people would actually be working for private clinics where there's not as much regulation around that. So it's another thing I'd just be aware of, that like when there is an incentive, people will act in a slightly different way. And you might like to think that like no doctors would do that, but unfortunately that is just not the case. So I'd be thinking about like what their other incentives might be. But I'd say like the crux of this, or like the somewhat simple cohesive answer to it, is at the moment I don't think there's a strong enough rationale for a perimenopausal woman who's not overweight to be taking these medications on the basis of improving perimenopausal or menopausal symptoms. They might have other reasons to take it. They might just be like, I want to make it easier to maintain a healthy weight and not feel hungry. Like maybe that's why they want to do it. To say that's right or wrong, like not really my place to say. And I will change my stance on that if more research comes out. But at the moment, based on what we know, there isn't really very much rationale. And then you also have the risk of muscle loss and bone mineral density decline if someone's undernourishing. Now, if you're taking like normal dosages of, for example, Mounjaro or Ozempic, a lot of the time, like you are really underfueling yourself, which means not so much of a bad thing if you have a lot of excess fuel, aka body fat, to like get rid of. But if you're someone who's already quite lean, like that's not a good position to be in. Like you don't want to put your body in that position. So you wouldn't want to be taking these medications, nor is there benefit for you to be doing so. So for someone who's very overweight, like the cost is, you know, in terms of potential side effects or like feeling nauseous, or even like something I haven't spoken about here, and maybe I will on another one, is like long-term dependency. Is like the benefits worth the cost for sure. But if you're already lean, like I just don't think the benefit is worth the cost. Okay, next question. Hi, Emma. I just read a thing on Facebook from Box Life magazine that said total protein trumps timing. They suggest front loading, say 80 grams at breakfast. 80 grams of protein at breakfast. That's quite a lot of protein at breakfast, I have to say. I thought it was best to spread through the day to better promote muscle protein synthesis. Can you debunk this one or otherwise? Thank you. Yes, I can. So the part that I do agree with is the total amount of protein that you consume is by far the most important part. So in that we agree. And for hypertrophy, probably aiming for somewhere around like 1.6 grams per kilogram per day would be a good aim. Slight tangent or side note here, resistance training is a far more potent stimulator of muscle protein synthesis than protein intake. So bear that in mind as well. Obviously, you need to be taking in protein, but I think sometimes people see them as almost even, or like if you eat more protein, you'll magically build more muscle. Like you won't. Like you need the thing that stimulates it, and the thing that stimulates it is resistance training. So that's very important. Now, where I don't agree, and I've never tried this myself, I don't think I've ever had a breakfast that has 80 grams of protein. Like that would be like a pretty big breakfast. I'd probably end up going back to bed because I don't know. I just think that's a lot to eat in the morning. Muscle protein synthesis is a dose responsive. What's the right term? It has a dose responsive effect, so it will plateau at some point. So in other words, like the response saturates. You can't just have more and more and more protein and get more and more and more muscle protein synthesis off the back of it. Now, usually, just to keep things simple and not overcomplicate everything, I will tell clients to get about 20 grams of protein per meal, because that's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. Now, if you want to get more specific, you can look at per kilogram body weight. So research will show that about 0.3 to 0.4 grams per kilogram body weight is actually what would maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis per meal. So if you're 70 kilograms, then that would be about 20 to 30 grams of protein per meal. Maybe like a bit more if, for example, you're older and you're experiencing anabolic resistance, but I wouldn't really start considering that until like 50 plus. And then the other thing you have to remember is there's also a law of diminishing returns to this. And by that, I mean, if you have 20 grams of protein, you are getting the vast, vast, vast majority of stimulus of muscle protein synthesis. If you add in double that, so you have 40 grams of protein instead, you only get a 10% extra increase. So the first 20 grams is giving you 90% of your muscle protein synthesis stimulation. The next whole 20 grams, doubling the amount of protein you have, is only giving you an extra 10%. So then you have to just think, is that worth it to me? Do I want to eat that much more? Does it mean that much to me? Now, bear in mind, that doesn't mean like you're going to build 10% more muscle. It's just that the rates of protein synthesis are 10% higher. And your net protein balance at the end of the day is more indicative of if you're going to build muscle or not, or how much muscle you're going to build. And that's much more to do with the relationship between protein synthesis and protein breakdown. So anyway, yes, there is a saturation point at each meal. Now, if you have more than that, there's no problem with it. It's going to add to your total protein intake throughout the day, but you're not going to stimulate muscle protein synthesis more because it's already been maximally stimulated. Now, the evidence on the impact of protein timing, because I think sometimes people hear that and they're like, oh my God, I need to get really scientific with this. I should have a protein bolus every 3 hours and, eat it in a certain way. The impact is quite small. It doesn't have a huge impact. It's just technically better, right? But most people, if they just spread their protein intake over like 3 to 4 meals, then they would have like a slightly better protein balance. But if you just have like your breakfast, lunch, and your dinner, and then a high protein snack, like you do that already, right? So you don't need to overthink it. Like most of my clients would do that naturally without having to make it a big deal. And then like on a very practical level, I also think that most people already struggle to get in enough protein at breakfast. Like most of my clients probably struggle to get in 30 grams of protein at breakfast. I don't think I even, I get in about 20 grams of protein at breakfast. So 80 grams would be insane and totally unrealistic, especially, if you're not a massive man. Like 80 grams of protein at breakfast for me would be a really stupid amount of protein to be consuming, and also kind of a stupid amount of calories based on my net calorie need for the day. So it's not something I would recommend for myself, and thus I would never suggest that my clients do it either. And like I do agree that I'm trying to give them probably more credit than they're due with that recommendation, but most people do undereat protein at breakfast. So bringing protein levels up, say to a decent amount of like 20 grams or more, will absolutely help, especially because I do think the protein that you have at breakfast is important after an overnight fast. I'd say that's probably, if you are going to have an important meal, then that would probably be the most important one to get in protein. But the benefit is really coming from going from someone who maybe just doesn't have any protein at breakfast and was used to having cereal to being like, oh, hey, we're going to add in some protein here. You'll get huge benefit from doing that. But you don't need to like mega dose it to the point that you like 80 grams of protein that you probably shit yourself on the way to work. Like not an ideal recommendation, I wouldn't say, for most people. So when it comes to protein, total amount of protein matters the most. Then on a practical level, I would aim for like 3 to 4 meals per day of at least 20 grams at each meal, because then you're going to almost maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. If you can have a little bit more, great. I wouldn't overthink it. Naturally, most people have, 20 to 25 grams at breakfast, similar at lunch, and then tend to have a slightly larger evening meal. if that works for you, don't overthink it. Have a high protein snack at some point in between. But I wouldn't be going for the, 80 grams of protein at breakfast. Not required, not supported by evidence, and not very helpful for anyone who actually wants to adhere to a diet and not shit your pants. So there we go. And those are the two that I really wanted to cover today. Let me see. If anyone has anything they've seen or any questions on anything I've spoken about or any generally, let me know. I did have a few more, but I'm not going to lie, I didn't have time to really look at them. And some of them were just a bit silly. I was like, there's so much crap on the internet at the moment. Oh yeah, the classic, the female body isn't designed for constant linear output, let me explain, and then telling you how you need to train around your menstrual cycle, which has, as we've discussed many times, no evidence to support outside of just, listening to your body. When you push the same way every day, your cortisol climbs, recovery crashes, strength, speed, and energy stall. Biology won't wait for nobody. When you can just tell it's fucking written by ChatGPT, like, can't you just even edit it like the tiniest bit? Like, who actually talks like that? Cortisol climbs, recovery crashes, strength, speed, and energy stall. Biology, like, it is literally word for word, copy and paste from ChatGPT. It's so obvious now as well. And also what's quite like sad in a way is this is like talking about performance, and actually you probably I'd argue you will most likely get worse performance outcome if you start randomly training around your menstrual cycle in the way that like some of these posts suggest, i.e. changing your volume based on the part of the cycle that you're in. And the reason for that is that your total volume over the month will be lower, which is obviously silly. And you won't get as good results from that if you're reducing your output like unnecessarily. Obviously, if you're someone who like really struggles with PMS or can't get to the gym at those times, or it's too painful to train, that's a completely different situation. But to be randomly changing your training volume because you think you're at a certain phase in your cycle will get you worse results. And really interesting work showing that, one, I mean, we probably all know this from like a just kind of being a woman experience, but most cycles aren't the same length. Most cycles aren't exactly 28 days. About 50% of women are on some kind of hormonal contraception anyway. So then this all gets thrown completely out the window. And even when you look at, say you did have the perfect 28-day cycle, when you look at that nice graph that's like, oh, here's what's happening to your different hormones, here's where estrogen peaks, here's where progesterone peaks, these are the certain days of your cycle. It doesn't actually match up when they do the tests on women on like day 5, this is what should be happening with your estrogen. It doesn't match up anyway. So there's like so many layers to this being wrong. Like the first primarily being there's no evidence to support it. The second being, even if there was evidence to support it, actually what it's based off doesn't work. The third being, for most women, it's not applicable anyway because they're on hormonal contraception, or their cycle doesn't exactly fit into a 28-day period anyway. So stop overcomplicating it. You don't need to overcomplicate it. There you go. You're welcome. I know that's harder to sell and monetize, which is probably why you still have so many people saying that. But, there you go. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you do think it would be useful to anyone, please do pass it on. And if you do want me to cover anything next week, please do shoot me a message. Probably Instagram is the best place, which is at ESG Fitness, if you don't already follow me. And okay, that's all. Have lovely evenings. Bye.